Imagine it's the early 19th century and you're about to start work in one of Northern England's cutting-edge cotton mills. You turn up here 6 days a week for a grueling 12-hour shift, possibly more, depending on your boss. It's not great pay, it's dangerous, and worst of all, you can't even complain about it.
Come on, you're late! Time is money for Britain's burgeoning cotton business. And if you're lucky enough to own a mill like this, well, you stood to make a fortune. As for how you treated your working population, well, you could keep them well housed and well fed, or you could work them till they drop. It was really up to you.
In this episode, we'll explore what life was really like inside an industrial cotton mill, stepping into the shoes of the men, women and children who worked here.
People who worked in these cotton mills would at times have an average life expectancy in their sort of mid-30s. Is it true?
And, using contemporary accounts and testimony, we'll discover that your experience of the Industrial Revolution could be very different, depending on what you did for a living,
Well, there you go.
and your place in society. From the Greg's perspective, this here represents a really good deal.
So the question is, could you survive working in a place like this?
This is Quarry Bank in Cheshire. Built in 1784 by the renowned entrepreneur Samuel Gregg, it remains one of the best surviving bastions of the Industrial Revolution. Within 15 years of its construction, there were 900 mills like it built across Britain, producing immeasurable quantities of textiles such as cotton, wool, silk and linen, and enormous profits for a new class of industrialists. In the late 18th century, raw cotton was shipped to Britain from its imperial territories and the newly independent United States. New inventions such as the flying shuttle and spinning jenny, combined with massive investment, led to the development of new machines which turbocharged the scale of production. Soon, processed cotton made up an incredible 50% of Britain's exports. And the majority of it was produced here in the northwest of England. Densely populated cities like Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield provided a ready labour force, the region had an abundance of fast-flowing rivers to generate power, and the rapidly expanding port of Liverpool allowed products to reach a global market. When investing in the construction of a large industrial complex, you had to choose your site carefully. Now, you may have noticed we're not exactly in the heart of Manchester here at Quarry Bank, but we are right next to the source upon which all of our machinery would depend for power. The River Bollin provided the water power required to operate the machines inside the cotton mill. All that was needed was a giant water wheel to harness this energy. Once you have that piece of crucial infrastructure in place, you just need to bring in a workforce. Now, a mill like this in the middle of the countryside required a lot of labour.
You'd start work at 6 in the morning. At some mills, you'd have to walk several miles to get here in all weathers, probably even worse than today. And that might mean getting up in the middle of the night. But there was no excuse for lateness. Once the machines were running, there was no time to lose. You might already think you'd have to be mad to work in a place like this. And the ear-splitting noise was the least of your worries if you were a mill worker. But many poor people didn't have a choice. They'd moved from the countryside to the cities in their droves, looking for a better life. And at least here, your whole family could be earning a wage. In fact, you were more likely to be signed up
if you brought your children with you.
Why do you allow your children to work at those places where they are ill-treated or overworked?
Necessity compels a man that has children to let them work.
Then you would not allow your children to go to those factories under the present system if it was not from necessity.
No!
There were many jobs in a mill like this one, some with quite strange names. There were packers, piecers, overlookers and underlookers, reachers in, doffers and drapers. Theoretically, your age and experience would determine what role you'd get, at least if you were a man. Attitudes at the time meant that women were barred from most highly skilled jobs.
Career progression in the mills did exist too. You could rise through the ranks, arriving as a child apprentice and going on to become a foreman or engineer. There are a few examples of that happening at Quarry Bank. Engineers were highly prized and well paid because keeping these machines running smoothly was so important. Everything depended on them.
Mill owners needed to find a way to run as many machines as possible. Quarry Bank was powered by an enormous water wheel like this one, known as the Great Wheel. It's one of the most impressive in Britain. Weighing in at 44 tonnes, it provided the factory with 100 horsepower. It would change the way we worked forever. You see, for centuries, the British working population had been scattered, labouring in their own homes or in the fields. Now they came from the countryside to the cities in search of a better life. For the first time in history, hundreds of people came to these factories to toil on these machines under one single roof.
The spinning mills are now working until 8 p.m. by gaslight. Unless one has seen it for oneself, it is impossible to imagine how glorious is the sight of a big cotton mill when a facade of 256 windows is lit as if the brightest sunshine was streaming through the windows.
The first mill here was designed as a long, low block with these huge windows which would theoretically flood the space with light. But at Quarry Bank, the lower panes were actually covered to stop the workers getting too distracted. In fact, in many mills, labourers barely got to any sunlight at all. They had to stay focused on their jobs. In the decade since its foundation, Quarry Bank kept on growing and growing. A second water wheel had been added, a new mill block and these new weaving sheds had all been added to Samuel Gregg's original building. It had become one of the biggest cotton manufacturing hubs in Britain, and it had become a family business, passed on from one generation to the next. It was a combination of initiative and useful family contacts that allowed Samuel Gregg to expand his business, establishing new mills in places like Lancaster, Bury and Bollington, employing more than 2,000 people. Even the Napoleonic Wars didn't halt Gregg's progress. Their overall returns between 1819 and 1831 averaged 13.2%, far higher than any other factories in the area.
By today's standards, work in the mills seems harsh, particularly as regulations barely existed. But from the perspective of ordinary people at the time, there were some benefits. Work in a factory was considered more secure than elsewhere, and there were real incentives to produce as much as possible.
Rex, I've turned up for my first day of work at Quarry Bank, and we're standing in front of this magnificent machine here. Can you tell me, what was the development that meant that cotton spinning moved from people's homes into a factory like this one?
There were some early developments, but the key machine, if you will, is this one, the spinning mule, mainly because it allowed the mass production of cotton yarn that was suitable for both elements in the fabric, both the warp and the weft. Before that, you would have to use either wool or linen for the warp, and it's more expensive.
In layman's terms, as I've said, I've just turned up for my first day. How does the spinning mule actually work?
The spinning mule works by this part. The carriage would normally be right at the back there, and when you set the machine going, it would begin to move forwards relatively slowly, and it's feeding the prepared cotton off the back and drawing it out to thickness. Once it gets out here, the cotton is down to the thickness that we require, but then it needs to put the strength into that by twisting the fibres. That's done out on the head here. Once it's spun that, this particular machine will change over automatically. As it goes back in, it's winding what has now become spun thread down onto these bobbins on the front.
Okay, so these bobbins, they're spinning round, so they'll essentially fill up with cotton, and then these will be removed?
Yes. Absolutely.
And that's doffing the mule, isn't it?
It is.
Can you tell me a little bit about doffing the mule? Because it's something we hear quite a lot about.
Yeah, well, once the bobbins are full right to the top, you've then got to stop it to change it over. Obviously, you can only put so much on there. So you would set the machine up so that it thought that it had empty ones on. And what that would do is wind the thread around the bottom down there. That allows you then to take these off and just snap the yarn but leave it attached to the spindles.
Okay.
You take the whole lot off, you replace them with a set of new ones, and it's more or less ready to go again.
Right, okay. And removing all of the bobbins all along this line, presumably that's quite a long job. Do they get quite efficient at doing these kind of things?
Yeah, they get very efficient at it because the payment on any of these machines is on results. On this machine, it's the number of cycles it completes, and that means that every time it stops, it's costing you money.
And let's talk about pay. So if I'm a completely inexperienced worker and I've been told to come and report to the spinning mule, what am I likely to get as a basic wage when I arrive at Quarry Bank?
It varies it through time, obviously, but the mule spinner, he's one of the highest paid people in the industry. But for somebody coming in right at the beginning, as an adult, learning to become a piecer, which is mending the threads when they break, you could be getting somewhere between 5 and 10 shillings a week at that time. So.
And presumably that is a little bit more than you'd get working in agriculture. I guess that's why people are coming to work here.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing about coming working in the mill, it gives you a security that the agricultural economy can't give you. You come to Quarry Bank Mill or any of the mills at that time, you'll work for the prescribed length of time, and you will get paid what you earn on a weekly basis. So you know what's coming. If you're in the agricultural economy, a bad summer means you'll starve this winter anyway, no matter how hard you work. So there are no guarantees with the agricultural economy. It was hard work. There was insecurity as far as we're concerned nowadays, but for those people back then, I could imagine this being seen as a very good opportunity.
You ask me why we work in the mill? Because the time we do have is our own. The money we earn comes promptly, more so than in any other situation, and our work, though laborious, is the same from day to day.
With the conditions in the room just right, we can now see the spinning mule in action.
I can tell it's quite warm in here now.
It is now.
You've been waiting for it to get quite warm so that this thing works.
Yeah, all morning, yeah.
And at the time that these were in operation, the humidity in here would have been quite high, and that was crucial for the cotton, right?
It is. Without that humidity, the cotton fibres don't move smoothly. You get inconsistent yarn. You get a lot more breakages. Below a certain temperature, the fibres themselves will become brittle and break anyway. But once you're above that, that's the humidity you need.
But you're happy that we've reached the right temperature and we can turn this thing on?
We're okay now.
Let's give it a go.
I think we can run it.
Kids will be working under here while it was running. So this carriage, they had to get out of the way as it moved back. Sometimes they said they had to lie flat on the floor to avoid being crushed. You can see there's a gap underneath where they could just about avoid it.
You might think using children to work the machines was particularly cruel, but as far as owners were concerned, it was a perfectly normal business practice, backed up by legal contracts. I'm sat inside the mill manager's private office here at Quarry Bank, and in front of me I have an extraordinary document. This here is the earliest surviving original child indenture contract, signed in 1785. This document concerns a young boy. His name was Thomas Royley, and he was only 11 years old. And although he leaves his mark right here, you can see, it's actually signed on his behalf by the overseer of the poor and the mill manager, William Faulkner. And what really strikes me with this document is the length of time in which he's contractually obliged to work for Samuel Gregg. It says here that he'll be working until he's 21 years old. That's 10 years of his life. You'd have children who were as young as 5 or 6 years old, working on those extremely dangerous machines in those really awful conditions. But for many of them, it was the best deal they were going to get. It was either that or they would starve or be abandoned in the workhouse. This here represents a very, very good deal for the Greggs. They're essentially getting cheap labour. I mean, some of these children may have been paid 1 or 2 pence per week if they were handed over by their parents, but if they came from the workhouse, they wouldn't even be offered any salary at all. And it's interesting that this is in 1785. The original building was only constructed in 1784, and it just shows you how acceptable the idea of using children and exploiting children for their labour was in the late 18th century, and how crucial it was for this whole operation.
Now, when Quarry Bank first started manufacturing cotton, around half of its workforce was made up of kids, and it stayed that way until the 1840s. Children as young as 5 or 6 were given some of the most menial jobs in the mill, and that particularly meant crawling into tight spaces in and around the machinery. Now, mule scavengers were required to crawl under the working machinery. They'd sweep up all of this loose cotton. It was a fire risk to leave it as it was, and this stuff was just too valuable to go to waste.
I frequently had to be under the wheels, and in the consequence of the perpetual motion of the machinery, I was liable to accidents constantly. I was very frequently obliged to lie flat to avoid being run over or caught.
Serious and occasionally fatal injuries did occur down here, but there were longer term health risks too. You'd be breathing in excessive amounts of cotton dust, and that could cause a lung disease called byssinosis. No PPE, remember. Inflammation of the eyes, cancer of the mouth, and hearing loss with the machines running was all common too.
He also disliked the dust and the flue with which he was half suffocated. He soon felt sick. By constantly stooping, his back ached. Blinko therefore took the liberty to sit down, but this, he soon found, was strictly forbidden in cotton mills. His overlooker, Mr. Smith, told him he must keep on his legs.
In 1819, the Cotton Factory Act was passed, ruling that mills could only employ children over the age of 9 and restricting the working day to 12 hours. But it wasn't particularly well enforced, and exploitation continued. Plus, a 72-hour week for a 9-year-old is still quite a lot.
As the proprietor of a mill, little else mattered to me other than the quantity of product and level of profit. To hit production targets, my labour force would have to work hard. Any idleness would not go unpunished.
Children who worked long hours in textile mills were often exhausted and found it difficult to keep their eyes open, let alone maintain the speed of labour required by the overlookers. Unfortunately for them, strict levels of discipline were enforced by the ownership, and vulnerable youngsters had little protection from abuse.
In the mill, we were not only chastised, but beaten very badly. Our overseer was a man of very immoral character, a very bad man. He chastised us with any weapon that came to hand. The overlookers are also often in the habit of availing themselves of their control over the female children for very improper purposes.
Whether they were dozing off, whistling, speaking to a fellow colleague, momentarily peering out the window, it was all considered idleness. A couple of hits with the strap would usually do the trick. There's even a story of a boy having his ear nailed to a table. Sometimes, mill bosses would get a little more creative to keep their workers in line.
When I was 7 years old, I went to work at Mr. Marshall's factory at Shrewsbury. If a child was drowsy, the overlooker touches the child on the shoulder and says, "Come here." In a corner of the room, there is an iron cistern filled with water. He takes the boy by the legs and dips him in the cistern and sends him back to work.
At Quarry Bank specifically, discipline was enforced in a slightly less brutal manner. Workers could find themselves owing their employers if they were fined for being a few minutes late for work. Now, if you were a child who wasn't paid a salary, that would mean working overtime for sometimes up to 14 hours a day.
Now, with punishments like those hanging over you, socialising with your colleagues while you're at your station wasn't highly recommended. There'd be no gossiping over a cup of tea here. In fact, to communicate at all with the loud machinery, some workers would have had to use sign language or become expert lip readers.
What? Come again, boy!
Workers were generally allowed a break at lunchtime, but sometimes even that had to be eaten on the factory floor. Some people complained that their food was so covered in dust that they couldn't eat it, or that the heat and exhaustion had caused them to lose their appetites.
What time was allowed for your meals?
40 minutes at noon.
And when your work was bad, you had hardly any time to eat it at all?
No. We were obliged to leave it or take it home. And when we did not take it, the overlooker took it and gave it to his pigs.
One of the only other places you could get a few moments to yourself was in here. And if you come in, you'll see it doesn't exactly look like much. It's really just a wooden seat over a bucket. But at the time that this mill was built, this would have been a state-of-the-art privy. Almost no one that worked here would have seen an indoor toilet before. The owners weren't exactly doing it out of kindness. They just wanted people to get back to the machines out there as soon as possible. There you go.
Mechanisation and the drive to increase productivity meant that people now worked to the pace of a new master: factory time. Every morning at 6 a.m, the workers were summoned by a steam whistle, and once inside the mill, would work in tandem with the tick of the clock.
This was a revolutionary change for ordinary working people. No longer were their lives dictated by daylight or seasons. They now religiously followed that machine up there.
The clock outside on the tower is operated with this piece of machinery here. It would have been looked after and wound constantly. In later years, at Quarry Bank, the Greggs introduced what were known as slave clocks, synchronised to show the exact same time across the property all throughout the day. Now, with this technology, the Greggs could control their workforce. Now, there is, at the very least, a suggestion that some of the more unscrupulous mill owners would actually tamper with this machinery here. They would slow it down during the day and then speed it up during the night to get even more out of their already exhausted workforce. They could even then fine them for turning up late.
Excuse me, where do you think you're going? You're late for work.
I only just finished my shift.
I think you'll find that the clock never lies. Get back in there now.
Factory workers had no choice but to push through their exhaustion. Up to 40% of accidents dealt with at the Manchester Infirmary in 1833 were factory and mill related, most of them occurring in the last few hours of a shift. Lost fingers and broken bones were among the most common complaints.
So Rex, we've got towards the end of a grueling 12-14 hour shift. Now presumably, not only are people completely exhausted, they're falling half asleep. There's got to be a lot more risks in a room like this towards the end of the day.
Yeah, there has to be. We haven't got statistics exactly of what happened and when and what time, but logically, then as you get more tired, when you think that you're working against the speed of the machine and it doesn't change, then that's likely to be when accidents are more likely to happen, certainly.
And what kind of accidents are we talking about mainly? What do the records show?
A lot of it will be slips, trips and falls, as it often is. But we do have examples of people having some pretty serious accidents as a result of simple mistakes working on the machinery.
Do we know of any fatalities here at Quarry Bank?
We do. In the records there are 4 recorded fatalities, 3 adults and 1 child. The child fatality happened in 1865. The young boy called John Foden was 11 years old. He was employed by the mill as a scavenger, so he's cleaning the floor, cleaning the back of the machine. And for whatever reason, and it isn't recorded the exact detail of what happened, he was caught up underneath the mule as it went back in and killed instantly. We also have serious accidents recorded. We have a gentleman called William Bower back in the 19th century operating carding machines, and there was a safe process for putting a new supply of cotton on the back of a carding engine which kept you safe. But on this occasion, again for whatever reason we don't know, he chose to put the new one and push it in with his fingers, and it cost him the bottom half of his left arm.
Right, okay.
Just a simple mistake.
So yeah, some serious injuries and serious risks.
Oh yeah.
One description of mill workers filing out of a factory leaves us in no doubt of the hardships they faced.
Their complexion is sallow and pallid, with a peculiar flatness of feature. Their stature low, the average height of 400 men being 5 feet 6 inches. Their limbs slender and playing badly and ungracefully. A very general bowing of the legs, a spiritless and dejected air, a sprawling and wide action of the legs, and an appearance, taken as a whole, giving the world but little assurance of a man, or if so, most sadly cheated of his fair proportions.
I've read a statistic that people who worked in these cotton mills in the 19th century would at times have an average life expectancy in their sort of mid-30s, which sounds crazy. Is it true?
It is true. It's an average statistic, as you pointed out. It would seem to be affected more by the conditions that you lived under rather than the conditions you worked under. Of course, the overcrowded conditions in the towns and cities is a direct result of the coming of the cotton industry, but we know statistically in the 19th century, tuberculosis, for example, accounts for more than half of the working class deaths in this country.
Okay, so it's not necessarily always connected to their work here at the mill. Presumably, working in an environment like this can't have helped, though.
No, it can't have helped. We will look at our records here, and we would see that in the 1840s, average life expectancy would be around 42 years. There were parts of the Irwell down in Manchester where it was 19 years, but that's mainly down to tuberculosis, cholera, hepatitis, typhoid.
That is
those sort of things. And
pretty
it's
shocking.
overcrowded and poor infrastructure.
But presumably there are also examples on the other side of people who worked here their entire lives and remained healthy into retirement.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In the pay books and the rent books and that, we find people certainly living into their late 60s, early 70s.
And Rex, what were the changes? What were the changes in the law over the 19th century that improved things for workers in a place like this?
They were many and varied. The main improvement for people, although they wouldn't see it at the time, was reducing the working hours for everybody and increasing the minimum age for children and introducing the requirement for education for children. But it happens sort of piecemeal throughout the 19th century, that.
Do we know whether they were enforced particularly well?
The workers have very few rights. If you don't like the rules in your mill, go find another job, is the usual thing. A lot of the change is coming from the actions of campaigners for change at the time, people like Wilberforce and Shaftesbury and that, who are lobbying Parliament to look at the situation in the mills, and it's not just cotton mills, but in the mills in general, and to look at improvements where they can be made. They're not always beneficial to the people concerned. One of the introductions was the 10-hour Bill of 1847, and it's known that Robert Hyde Gregg here campaigned against its introduction, but the argument he used was that his workers would suffer hardship and famine because they weren't working for as long, they weren't going to earn as much.
So workers might not always have wanted these regulations.
Doesn't seem to be the case.
No. I guess
Yeah.
just from our 21st century perspective, we might see it differently. We might just see them as a great thing.
Yeah. Of course, you've got to remember there's no benefit system there. If you don't earn it, you haven't got it. So you've got to earn everything you've got. And parity is introduced later in the 19th century, but initially it wasn't. If you worked 6 hours, you got 6 hours pay, and if you worked 12 hours, you doubled it.
By 1830, the Greggs' cotton business was booming. A year later, Samuel Gregg and Company, in which the engineer Peter Owett and Gregg's 4 sons were partners, owned 5 factories, over 400 power looms, employed over 2,000 people, and turned £4 million of cotton into cloth. Thanks to cotton, Britain was quickly becoming one of the richest nations in the world. But many were starting to question the moral cost of the whole operation. It was no secret that the profits enjoyed by the Greggs was built not only on the exploitation of workers in Britain, but on the back of an abhorrent institution across the Atlantic. Just as port cities such as Bristol, Glasgow and Liverpool owed their rapid growth to the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, the Greggs family enterprise relied on the same commerce to maintain its profits. Whilst their supplies of cotton came from slave plantations in the Americas, the textile products created at mills like Quarry Bank would then be sold by traders in Africa in return for captured slaves, who could then be transported across the Atlantic. Samuel Gregg himself inherited a sugar plantation on the island of Dominica, which used enslaved African labourers, and the cotton garments produced here at Quarry Bank were used to clothe those same enslaved workers. But times were changing, and the oppression of people over in the Americas and in the factories here in Britain could not go on indefinitely. In fact, no matter how favourable the Greggs considered the working and living conditions to be here at Quarry Bank, more and more of his labour force were no longer willing to tolerate being denied human rights and representation.
In the next episode, we'll discover what life was like during the Industrial Revolution outside of the factories, both for the rich.
Wow, look at this. Very grand, isn't it?
And the poor.
It's work, bit of lessons, straight to bed, up to do the same thing the next day.
We'll go behind closed doors to see where people ate, slept and learned, and look at how a wave of social change eventually brought improvements
for ordinary workers.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel. Hope you enjoyed that video.
And if you'd like to see more videos where we attempt to try and bring history to life, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell.
Cheers guys, see you soon.